Assemblyman Crouch.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioner. Good morning. You mentioned earlier and answered one of the questions about the training academy to maintain the ranks of your public protection program. These are the environmental police that are going out. Are they also classified, some of them, as foresters?
Forest rangers.
Forest rangers, yes. Okay. Speaking of our state forest, I ask this every year, as far as the people from your department that go out and mark trees so you can market those trees on state land, I'm still getting complaints from loggers that the state's not managing their forest lands well, marketing the trees, they're dying on the stump, and obviously being subjective to some of the invasive species that we're seeing more and more of. Any plan for increasing your marketing of the forest lands?
Yes, and I think we have made some significant progress in that regard. It's slow and incremental, but we've made progress. The last 2 years in a row, we've actually generated about $5.5 million from timber sales on state land, and those are all supervised by DEC staff. And it's the first, I think this year and last was the first time that we actually generated more income than expenses, which is a good thing. And the incremental revenue that we are getting from the sale of timber, we think we ought to be able to fund temporary positions so that we can actually cut additional timber on state lands.
Sure.
So we plan to do that this year. Plan to add to the ranks will be temporary staff and seasonal staff.
Okay.
And then the other point I would make is that the habitat conservation account that I mentioned in my testimony, those funds and the 18 staff people that we will get for those funds will be used in our wildlife management areas to cut timber to create early successional habitat, which is good for bird watchers, hunters, you name it, outdoors folks generally. So those funds actually flow back into the conservation fund, but that will also help us, more intensively manage state land, because we have the ability to sustainably harvest considerably more wood on state lands than we have in the past, and it's been mostly due to staff shortages historically that haven't allowed us to cut what we think is, again, perfectly sustainable and reasonable, and will actually improve habitat on those lands.
Well, as you know, a well-managed forest land is, it really helps our wildlife management, because,
yep.
Even in some cases, you may have some areas that need to be clear-cut so that it really has a full rejuvenation. Yep. And that's very beneficial to wildlife. Speaking of invasive species, there's about 50 or so that are in the state that we recognize. There's some 18, I think, in the Adirondack Park. What's your current plan for handling some of the invasive species that we seem to be seeing an increasing amount of all the time?
Well, thanks to both legislative actions and our regulations, we've had a lot of activity. We put out an aquatic invasive species plan. We've put out the regulations that were required from the bill that you passed into law that specifies both prohibited and regulated species, invasive species. Mm-hmm. So we put out that list, and it is extensive. We and state parks have both issued regulations requiring any visible aquatic any vegetation period that is attached to boats to be removed before it's put in the water. We've had a very successful program on Lake George with the boat washing program there. So we've been extremely active. I think in the EPF and the aquatic invasive species, or in the invasive species line rather, there's a $1 million enhancement that we hope to target the Adirondacks as kind of a pilot program for addressing aquatic invasive species elsewhere other than Lake George. So we've been very active, and again, I think largely in cooperation with you.
Is there an increase in your budget to handle some of this, or is it static at this point?
Well, the increase is in the Environmental Protection Fund.
In the Adirondacks, if you have invasive species that attacks, like the Asian longhorn beetle, your typical program has been to cut those trees. I know there's a lot of restrictions in the Adirondack Park about cutting trees. Does DEC have the authority at this time that if you see a pocket that's being, invaded by the longhorn beetle or the ash borer, that you have the authority to come in and go in and cut those trees before it gets into a real explosive situation?
A tricky and delicate topic, obviously, because the state constitution prohibits or extremely restricts our ability to cut trees in the park. So that's a topic that we are talking about internally to figure out what and how we would respond to an outbreak in the park. I do think we have the authority in limited cases to undertake cutting when it's necessary, again, to prevent extensive damage and minimize the damage. But that's something that we're obviously looking at very carefully because invasive species are a huge issue and the park presents very special challenges.
Okay. Where are we on the final approval of the Bel Air Resort project? That's been going on for well over 10 years. And
it's been a long process.
Governor Spitzer moved it along considerably at one time, but it's still languishing out there somewhere.
Well, it's not. It hasn't been languishing. It's been a very active administrative process. We have several parties that are involved. We have to actually close the record from a previous administrative proceeding in which my staff has recommended doing. We've actually, when we propose something, all the parties have a chance to comment, and the parties have asked for additional time. In this case, I believe the applicant has asked for additional time to submit additional documentation. So when that is complete, and I think we gave a very limited amount of time, I expect a decision on that, again, very shortly.
This year, possibly?
Oh, yes, okay. Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you.
My time's up. Thank you.
Thank you.